All right. Well, how's everybody else doing? Feel free to just say hello. I know that these meetups tend to be a couple of weeks apart, so sometimes people change, things change. Um, Actually, one of the things that I wanted to learn about with all of you, in addition to this meetup, is what are you all focused on at the moment, especially 2020 is almost over. And we're going into a new year essentially. And so there might be a lot of new things that or goals you guys are setting for yourselves. So I'd like to know like what kind of things you are all looking at and would like to know more about for 2021.
I have so I'm getting ready for interviews and I've been coding in React for a while, but I have a hard time explaining concepts. So anything theoretical that might come up on an interview would be nice to go over.
Sure. Do you all see my screen right now by any chance?
Yeah, DuckDuckGo.
Yeah, that's my default search engine right now. So I'm going to share my GitHub. It's not like the world's best GitHub or anything like that, but I do feel like it's worth it to at least kind of share some stuff that, I look at, especially with the group, because I love to just kind of share and then get back like notes too for people all around. So if you go to my GitHub, there's a repo, there's a lot of different repos that I have, but one in particular that I really liked was this React.js interview questions. Maybe some of you are familiar with it, some of you aren't, but you can fork it from this Sudhir J. And he does a really good job of going through like, I think almost 500 React questions that they might ask you in an interview. So, I've been going through this list. I actually went through it twice. It's pretty straightforward. It's not that difficult to, read through. You can do like, maybe 20 or something like that, every day, just kind of like read a little bit, try out some of this sample code. And
What's
then
the value in forking it?
Well, if you see a mistake, then you can,
Oh,
make a push and a pull request, and then basically like, this repo can be more up to date.
Can you pass a link to that to the chat? That sounds good.
Yeah. So let me go ahead and see. Yeah.
On that note, my company has actually pulled questions straight from that repo for interviews at my current company. So it's definitely a great resource.
which question number?
We randomly pick, but ones that are the most applicable tend to be asked.
Yeah, it's really good. It's really important to, just kind of like read through it. I like these crowdsourced ones just because they are all like, a little bit more polished, as opposed to something like, like you read in maybe some, I don't know, Medium article. That's what a lot of developers tend to do, which I think is okay. Medium's okay, it's a good place, but I like stuff that's peer reviewed. That's just me, So like I said, this is a community resource. You can just go there. A lot of this stuff is pretty much like peer reviewed and then pull requested. So, and going back to this, right? Like I felt like, okay, I don't know that much about React. When I first kind of like was diving into this, I don't know when it was, but I didn't really know it that well. And then I started just kind of quizzing myself almost like in a flashcard way. Something I use is called Anki. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but I'll share that with you as well. It's like this flashcard generator. It's really cool because you can make like your own flashcards and then have it quiz you on basically like whatever you're studying. So like, for example, React, right? I can go through this, or I can browse like my deck, and then like I can find stuff. And then, I can write in my cards here essentially. And then basically like when it says study now, I can say, okay, how to set state with a dynamic key name. Here's the show answer. So, I mean, you can do it that way if you want. if you're good, you can go to the next question. Is resolved. One other thing that, I kind of do a lot now is the team hack stuff. So I'll quickly talk about that and then I'll hand it over to Dylan because I know he has to get started on his meetup. But so Team Hack is this initiative that, our group, HackBuddy, formerly called JavaScript LA, started doing. It's basically open source coding. And so a lot of us basically just kind of, from the group, let's see if I can kind of move some of this to the side. Like so. Let's go ahead and move that out of the way. All right, so, and then I need to sign in. Okay, so hang on one sec, and yeah, two-factor authentication. But essentially, the idea is that we do a whole bunch of code together, and then we have different projects that we are working on at the moment. One is a React storybook, and then that one is pretty cool because that has helped me really use React and learn more about it. So the whole idea with this storybook stuff is that you yarn install it, and then the idea is that we're all kind of building reusable components. So like stuff that you might see in Bootstrap, like alert, dividers, buttons, navs. I think pictures and like images really kind of showcase everything. So like if you go to our actions page and you take a look at some of the tests we've been running, you can get a link to the storybook and check it out. So I think this is the view storybook link. So, and then basically like the way storybook works is you define your components in here, and then you can play around with the components. You can have like different inputs. Here's a card. This one is pretty fleshed out, which is cool. This is a header and footer component. And so like the way I look at Storybook is it's a way to kind of build like your UI, in like this, almost like, what would you do? I would describe it as probably like, like a sample, agency kit or some kind of like simple style guide for yourself if you wanted to reference and say, okay, we're gonna have, this card component and it's gonna look like this, and here are all of the inputs. You can align it to the left, you can align it to the center, you can align stuff to the right, and let's see here, you can set the width. Let's see, yeah, okay, so that's pretty dynamic. And obviously this is in the works, but like, obviously you can have different states for your buttons. You can have a large button, you can change the text. So it's kind of like a UI kit in some ways, that you can basically take code from and then drop into your next project. So the idea is you build your code here first, then it becomes reusable code that you can drop into a future project. So you don't have to keep rebuilding these components again and again and again. Places like Airbnb and some of the other websites that I've visited have a really good storybook, and basically they create all their UI components there, and then essentially they drop it into projects. So they have like calendars and widgets and all kinds of different things that they add to their storybook, and it basically gets dropped in to future projects, and everything's battle tested, unit tested. So it's a good place to basically learn, practice a lot of the stuff you're doing. The easiest way to join Team Hack is to just basically go to teamhack.org, and then you can help us by just signing up. There's a form, you just fill in all the info, tell us about who you are and what you've done. And then basically here's what we'll kind of build. So it's a work in progress. We're still building all the different things like this React components kit, but it's a good way to practice React, a good way to make pull requests, practice that, work with Git, work with issues, do stuff in a Scrum-like environment, play around with things like unit tests and Actions, GitHub Actions. These are all things that you might be expected to do in your job. And so, you know, with me at least, I didn't really feel like sometimes, you know, at my workplace, I was doing all the stuff that I would see asked in interviews. And so this is kind of another way to, you know, practice what I learned, right? I can play around with TypeScript in here. I can play around with tests, suites, React testing library, which is a newer testing unit, all the fun stuff that, you know, I probably wouldn't be able to do if I was just kind of doing my basic like work at my workplace. So if you want to join, again, it's teamhack.org. Sign in over here, and then if you want to learn more about the projects we're doing, you can just visit github.com/teamhack, and I'll go ahead and put a link to that in the chat as well. And just looking at chat comments, yeah, and it looks like everybody kind of answered their own questions. Used Anki for years, code snippets and images. Liz, did you have a question about that, or was it already answered?
I think I did see code snippets, but does it allow for images? The Anki that you're using?
You know, I'm not sure. I've never put an image in there, but I wouldn't see why not. Actually, one more thing. This was introduced to me by Ben, who's, you know, a frequent person in the group. And let me just see if we can pull this down. Okay, so Notion is pretty cool too. I use it in some ways like a flashcard. If you're familiar with stuff like Evernote or Notion, it's a good way to just kind of like put notes. Like right now I've been kind of working with Drupal a lot and having to like memorize a whole bunch of like patterns in PHP. So I'll go ahead and like put in notes in this fashion. And then, you know, I'll have like code snippets that I'll drop into. And I think like sometimes, you know, you can just like quickly look at these and scan it. So this is kind of how I do like a lot of my images and code snippets. And then the cool thing about Notion is that, like, you know, the way I look at it in some ways is it's your brain on the internet, you know, because humans aren't really able to keep track of all these different things. And so you need like an extra hard drive for your brain to keep track of like so many different things. So as you start like building out your brain on the internet, you can use tools like Evernote or Notion to kind of just like, all right, here's another huge idea. Let's stick this in a notebook, a digital notebook, and then anytime I want to go and look at a quick snippet or a quick flashcard, here it is. So I hope that helps. Yeah, and then you can use Shift Windows S to take screenshots. That's true for Windows. And then you want to reuse my Anki cards? Maybe I'll look into that. But with that said, let's go ahead and hold some of these questions to the end. And I'm going to pass it over to Dylan now.
So, hi, my name is Dylan Widjaja. I'm currently primarily a UI engineer. Excited to be here. Also with a exciting celebration as well, since I recently put in my notice to quit my job, and I'll be starting at Facebook in a couple of weeks. And so I'll drink to that. Usually I've been to meetups that are usually at breweries, if not breweries, at least places that have beer. I'm drinking Voodoo Ranger. But yeah, so I'll get started. So actually on the topic that VJ was talking about with building that component library, this talk is actually really well suited for building out reusable components, and particularly in instances where you want to use inversion of control. And so that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about today, is inversion control in React. Although it is applicable in Angular and Vue, my bread and butter just happens to be React. And I also haven't really seen too many talks about inversion control in React before. And so that's mostly why I'm opting to go for this. So let's get started. So what is it? So inversion control is, according to Wikipedia, the custom code that expresses the purpose of the program calls into reusable libraries to take care of generic tasks, but with the inversion of control is the framework that calls the custom or task-specific code. And so I referenced Kent Dodds a lot. I think he's a great reference in terms of React. And so his translation is make your abstraction do less and make your users do that instead. My definition, and which I'll be elaborating a little bit more on in my examples, is build your components in such a way so that way they perform their purpose, but allow the user, which in our case is primarily going to be the engineer rather than the end user, determine how it's used. So basically, we're allowing the engineer to have a better engineering experience, and the user in turn will also benefit from that as well. And so we'll move on. If you don't know who Kent Dodds is, this is Kent Dodds. That's me on the right. This was at React Conference 2019. It's a really cool guy. I like him a lot. I would recommend his live streams and his blog as well. So where inversion of control comes into play. So React, as well as many UI libraries, are really built around reusable components. And so how you build those reusable components really determines how reusable they truly are, right? It's really easy to build a reusable component, but then get pigeonholed into a very, very specific implementation of this component. And that's what we want to try to avoid. We want to allow our components to be as usable as possible. So that way we don't have to keep rebuilding reusable components over and over again that fulfill very, very specific purposes. And so that's essentially what this is going to be talking about. So I have 3 primary examples I want to go over. First will be a panel example. So I'll go ahead and switch over to my, my app. So all the code is on GitHub. I'll send the link later, but this is essentially what I'll be working on. And here is the code. And so we'll go ahead and check out panels 1. So basically what I want to do is focus on this initial panel, right? It's a fairly straightforward panel, right? It has a header, it has a body, and has a footer, right? And so when we build out a component like that, it's a fairly straightforward component, right? I hope you can see that well enough. It's big enough. Cool. If not, let me know. And so something like this, and by the way, I'm doing all of my code in TypeScript just to allow a little bit more specificity as to what I'm dealing with. But in a component like this, you can make it really straightforward and simple, right? I'll have a header, and that could be a string or a node, but for our case, let's say a string, body, and this could be a JSX element as well as a footer, and this could be a string as well. Actually, let's make it a JSX element, as it could be buttons, for example. And then finally, in our component right here, right, we would return simply, actually I didn't need to add the curlies. So we'll have a div, right? Because we need to return multiple elements. We'll have a header, or props.header. We'll have a div for the body, props.body. Actually, we could probably even use children instead. And then we'll have a footer. And so this works. This is perfectly acceptable. It works exactly how we want it to. And if we go into my actual code that I had built for this, it looks very similar. It's just about the same thing. And so the point of this is that we can easily build a component. And so if we go over to the app, it works. But let's say we have a requirement from business, and business says that, oh, we need to do something special with this. We need to make it so that we can have multiple headers into this component, right? And so you go back to your code and you realize, oh, shoot, well, I only allowed myself to have a single title. I could just add another title into the children, but then it's now kind of it's not the same kind of title that I built up here, right? I have to now create that header as a child of this panel, right? So right here in old panel, right, this body would need to replicate a header that this old panel or this panel component is already doing. And we don't want to do that. And so let's introduce inversion of control. So how would this component look like if we use inversion of control? Instead, we'll have a panel, where is it? We'll have a panel component. And all it does is returns a div with whatever CSS you need, and probably an optional class name if you choose, and it's children. We'll also create a header component as well, allowing us to be able to have a very similar manner where we have a header, with whatever style that you need, and possibly custom class name if we need to choose to, and it just accepts children, right? So essentially we're building out our fragments of this component to use whenever we wish. And this is my personal preference, but I like to tag it onto the original root component. In our case, it's panel. You could export these as individual items. For example, like export as an object and have it as header like that. That's personal preference, essentially dealer's choice, but I personally like to do it like this. Reason being is because I know that this header directly corresponds with this panel, and I don't have to import anything else with it. And because methods are nothing but objects, we can just simply tag it on. Okay, so now that we have pieces of this panel, right, we can utilize those pieces however we wish. And so if we use this component, right, this is what the implementation would look like, right? We have a panel component which takes in children, right? And actually I'll put this side by side. We have a panel component which just takes children. It has a header component, right, which we could pass it whatever we need to, has a body, and if we need to, we can just simply use header once more and a body or a footer. And so essentially, on ideal situation, they should look, I didn't save it, they should look exactly alike, and they do. But this one is now significantly more flexible than this one on the left will ever be, because we have allowed ourselves to invert the controls of this component to the user, being me, the engineer, rather than the component, right? So the component only supplies pieces, right? And as the user, I get to determine how those pieces are used. Whereas in the old implementation, the component solely determines how those pieces are used. And this allows a lot more flexibility. We don't have to pass a header, we don't have to pass a body, nor do we have to pass a footer, right? Here's just the panel component alone, and you can not even have headers in there. We can just have a panel directly right here, and then just put content right inside. Oops, doesn't accept a string. Probably need to put in a JSX element. Oops, what is going on? Panel accepts only an array of children. That's a mistake on typing on my end. Not a big deal though. If we just wrap it in array, this should work. Hello world. That was a mistake on the typing, less about the code. But basically, we can put in whatever we need to into this component. It's wildly flexible. So at least that's my panel example. Any questions on that? I'm not sure if I'm going too fast or at good speed. So yeah, if there's no questions or any questions, I'm happy to answer before I move on to the next example.
And as always, you can ask your question by just unmuting yourself, and then quickly muting yourself again. You can also use the chat. I know sometimes people listening, there's a little bit of a delay. So if you're just starting to hear this, feel free to jump in. I'll give a few seconds.
I might be jumping ahead, but I was wondering, do you manage state at like a top level, or do you do that in the components themselves?
It really depends. And actually, that's really a good question to ask for my next example. I will, actually, I'll tackle that next then. All right, so the next example that I have is primarily dealing with drop-downs. Drop-downs, cool. All right, so we have the same app again. Let's refresh it. And we got two drop-downs, right? Both of them, again, one using inversion of control and one doesn't use inversion of control. But we also have an input here, right? That allows us to type in whatever. At this time, right now, nothing really happens. But along with your question, we could handle something like that. So here in the implementation of the old way that I would create a dropdown, here is the, let me comment out what is not relevant at this time. Here's the old dropdown. It's a single component which takes in items, and items would just be an array of objects. And this array of objects will be essentially the contents and information that we need for this dropdown. So it has an ID for a unique identifier or a way to select, right, the text that we need to display in this dropdown, as well as an on-click, although it could be optional. And so that way we can have unique methods per on-click, right? But again, this method or this component could easily take its own on-select. It's just how we choose to build it, right? In this case, we're having each item handle its own click. So if we go into the old drop-down component, right? Here, to answer your question, the state that this component holds really depends on what kind of state is needed. In this case, this component can handle its own state for the, my gosh, what's happening? Can handle its own state for the showing or not showing the list items. But the input could also be handled as a state in here, or you can even have it handled on the parent, right? It's ultimately what fits your need. And I know that's not a very specific question, or a very specific answer to your question, but it truly is, it depends on the need of the component that you are building. In this case, we don't really need that scenario, but we do need state to determine if we should show or not show the dropdown. So here we have that items that we had passed before, and I'll go back to that over here, right? Dropdown items, which is an array of items that gets passed to this component. This component takes an array of items and we simply map through them and render a button that allows us to on-click the item, which really doesn't really pass any kind of data, but we could if we needed to. And we just close the menu, which is, again, what we do right here. But again, we're talking about inversion control in this talk. This, again, doesn't really allow us too much flexibility in terms of how this item gets rendered. What if, for example, BA or business comes to you and says, hey, we need to add an icon right in front of the text, or hey, we need to change the styling, or we need to make something different other than just our conventional dropdown. Well, if you have this kind of component, again, you would have to refactor this entire component just to get a simple icon, or if not refactoring the entire component, here you would have to go to dropdown item and take an icon, make it optional, JSX element, right? And then here I have to conditionally render, probably right here, what is it? Icon, props.icon, render props.icon, otherwise null, right? And that's not a very clean way, right? Then what if they have a million things that they request? Now you have to do a bunch of very singular conditionals for a whole lot of not too much, right? Now this component becomes unnecessarily bloated just to have minor nuances here and there, right? So lo and behold, if we include inversion of control, we have a very different kind of component in mind now. So we'll go ahead and comment in. We'll take a look at the implementation. Very similar, where we have a drop-down wrapper, right? This is our main component. It could handle an on-select if you choose or not, but also per item, we can just simply create each item to handle its own on-click and handle its own method as needed. You know, this is dependent on your need, of course, and in fact, both drop-down and the item can have both on-select and on-click, again, making this component even more flexible to whatever the need is. So here in the component, right, we have the props. This is drop-down. Okay, that's correct. I believe the item. Okay, cool. So here we have the props of value being the what is currently selected, the on-select method, although I did make this one required for this type, and children, again, is just going to be JSX elements, right? And then here we have the main component, and we rendered the children. There is a nuance here that I will explain a little bit more, but basically we just map through the children and we display the items as needed. And as we go down to here, the item, right, takes in item props, the children on click value, and it's just the button that we render and handles as needed. And you can always add your custom styling here if needed. And yeah, it will just be your item. So the nuance that we have to run into here, though, is I'm using react.children.map. And this is a more of an abstract data type that React provides to use for instances where you don't know for a fact if React children is an array or is a single element. It's ambiguous, right? And so what if the user only renders a single item? Then it's not an array, right? So by having it as react.children.map, we can guarantee ourselves that we're able to iterate through the children. And so the issue that this essentially solves is that we need to add that on click that we had provided, right? as well as the onSelect, right? And so basically, this will map through the children. It will, get the props from the child, which we can type directly because we know we created this component. We can type the item that we have selected, as well as take out the props and then pass it to its onClick. So here we're just essentially overwriting the onClick that we got from this component, right? Here's that onClick. Here is the onClick that we passed to it. Here is the onSelect that we have defined as a prop on the parent. And then we're just setting show to false. And so the reason why we had to do this is because the child has to handle state of the parent, right? When the child is clicked, we need to let the parent know that we need to do something, right? In this case, it's onSelect and set show. So by doing clone element, we're able to pull that value out and then reassign the onClick with whatever we need it to do. This is a little bit, I guess, it took me a while to wrap my mind around, so I understand if this is a bit confusing. But yeah, essentially we're pulling out the child, right? And we're overriding the onClick with methods that we need to do on the parent side, which allows the child to have flexibility and control, in this case, of this component as a whole. Does that make sense? I hope that does, at least. But essentially, this is my drop-down example, right? A single drop-down component, a bunch of drop-down items, which you probably pass in a class name if you needed to. I didn't in this case, but let's say we even needed to add an icon, for example, right? Or an image. We can just really do so right here without any question as to how this is going to be rendered. Because again, the child is handling it rather than this component as a whole. To do this image alone in this old dropdown would be a nightmare, right? We would have to go over to the list of items. We have to change it here, and then we would have to change the component itself. Whereas this is fully flexible with allowing us to literally just put in whatever we need.
Dylan, we have a
What's
few
up?
questions.
Of course.
Some from Sherry. So she was asking if you could slow down a little bit first.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think there was a question about, I guess, what makes the code onClick flexible. So, like, I think she might be referring to, like, I guess if you could walk us through again, the part where you talked about react.children.map, maybe for those of who don't know what react.children is, maybe just kind of talk about that first and kind
Sure.
of. Thanks.
Yeah. Again, this is not as commonly used unless you really need to use it. And again, it's an ambiguous data type that React allows or provides to us, the engineers, to be able to handle children or any kind of node that you really pass it. Typically, it is children. By mapping through, we're able to map through the children. And the reason why we map through the children is because what if there's a single element, a single child in this React children? Well, then, this basically converts it into an iterable instance for us to use. And that's why we use react.children.map, because ideally in a list, we will have number of items that we need to render. The second method is just how we're going to handle that method. Very similar to a dot map where you would pass it a method. This map just takes in the first argument as the children. All right, so for every single child, we get a child node because again, react.children.map converts children into an iterable instance. So an array could be simply put. This child is the child node essentially. And because it's a child node, React provides us its props. We can pull that directly from child.props. Because we're taking props from a child in which we had defined down here, we know exactly what the types are for that prop. Therefore, we can actually just type it child props as item props as we get the values from child.props. Because we know exactly what those types are, we're able to get the onClick and value out of the child props, right? Second, we have to do react.clone element. And the reason why we have to do that is because as a child here, we can't render it as a child like that. That won't work because at least with the, I think it's the reconciler algorithm that goes with JSX, it doesn't read this as that value, right? So React provides us clone element, which allows us to literally clone the element of child. And the second parameter, second argument it takes are the new props. So here we're just going to spread child.prop. So everything that the child already has for props, we're just going to provide it right here. But the issue that we needed to solve in this instance is that we needed to have this child handle on select. Because the parent here dropdown, it doesn't know what is being clicked, right? Again, the item is what's handling being clicked, right? Because it's a button. And so since the button is the thing that is being clicked, the child button is being clicked, the parent there's no way to emit that kind of method up like you have in Vue. Vue, you have this $emit, and you can emit a method up to the parent. In React, we don't have that option. But we do have, again, React.children, which allows us to access the child nodes. Because we have access to the child nodes, we can call the onClick method that is corresponding with the item child. And again, onClick is optional, which is why we had to optionally chain the method or optionally call the method right here. You could do it if check to see the presence of onClick, but this is just shorthand. But the main thing that we got to notice is the onSelect and the setShow here. Because the dropdown accepts an onSelect, right? That means as the user, myself, the engineer, I should be able to expect that whatever method I pass this onSelect here, it would receive the item that I am clicking, and I can do whatever I want with it on the parent. In order for that to be handled, the component itself needs to handle actually calling this onSelect with the value that you pass it, right? But again, remember, the parent has no idea what values or onClicks the child has. All of that is consolidated into this singular component, right? And so we need to access that. In order to access that, again, React.children, get the child node. Once we have the child node, we can call the onClick as well as the parent calling the onSelect and the setShow. And all we're doing here is assigning onClick of the child node a new method, right? This is an anonymous method we're providing to this onClick for the child node to handle the original onClick that was provided to the child, as well as handling the onSelect and the setShow, which is provided by the parent, and also the state change on the parent parent component. So yeah, that's essentially what this react.children.map and the react.clone element is doing in this scenario. Does that make more sense?
I think it does. I think some people were chatting in the chat. You may want to take a look at it too if you have access to it.
Let's see. Chat. There we go.
Yeah,
Sorry.
just if you want to
keep this open.
Yeah. So I'll kind of reiterate some of the stuff that was going on in the chat, just so we're all clear on the same page. The question was, what makes the onClick flexible? So, as you were talking to, and I think Andy asked, what would an example of a component look like with the children and the appropriate props passed in? So I just kind of said that I think the flexibility comes from the fact that, before at least what I understand, is that before you were sort of saying, okay, these components have like a defined structure where you have to have the event handler passed to the component, and you have to have, the text or the icon in the structure of the component. Whereas now you're kind of inverting that, right? Like you're saying, inverting a control. Basically, you're using the React children, property from React that allows you to kind of map over, any children, components that get thrown in, and then you're looking at basically what props are coming off of those children, as well as what event handlers are coming off those children, and then you're cloning that into a new component that basically renders with the parent component. And so by doing it that way, you can throw in custom, children components as opposed to having all of them follow the same format. So if one child needs an icon, it has an icon, whereas another one can have a custom event handler, or another one can have another custom event handler, and so on. Is that correct?
That's pretty spot on. I should clarify, when I say flexible though, this dropdown component is not this dropdown component, its complexities is what makes it flexible for the user. It's more flexible for the user now that we have built it this way, to be able to pass either an on select or an on click, right? As a user now, I have the flexibility to decide I want to handle each individual drop-down item, with an on click on its own. Or if I want to, I can remove all instances of on click. I can pass each drop-down item a value. That one you can't get away with, because otherwise the component has no idea what it's working with. But given that now the dropdown can handle an on select, right? And handle select directly right there, where it will accept an item, right? And the item will take the value again, which we pass right here. So for example, in these two dropdown items, they won't work in this very exact example because they don't have a value. So the way that we can mitigate that is either passing it a value of, whatever its contents or whatever you need it to be. It could even be an ID, or you can have it have handle what I put it as on click, and then handle click be whatever you need it to be, right? So the flexibility comes to the user of the component rather than the component being written this way, right? So it's the way that we write this component is what allows the flexibility on its usage. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think it does. If there are more questions though, like I know Sherry is asking a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, to answer Sherry's last question, what was it easier on the user? So again, the user could be is multiple definitions of user in our case, right? In this case, your customer of this component is the engineer. Whoever is using this component is the user in this instance, right? So not the end user who is actually seeing this on the application, but the user of this component. So as the engineer, my engineering experience is a lot smoother now, right? Because I basically upfronted the effort to be able to make this flexible enough so that way I have options and I can use it however I need to in order to make my engineering process a little bit more seamless. Cool. All right. I hope that answers that question. I know this was a pretty complex component, especially considering the React.children and the clone element are not very commonly used, at least to my knowledge, commonly used methods in React unless you need to. Kevin, great question. I actually have that in a later slide. So basically, here's the dropdown real quick. Again, they should look exactly the same, but just the flexibility behind the two is immense, I would say. All right. I went over the dropdown. So here's an advanced application of that of a dropdown, right? Both of these are the same exact dropdown component, just used in different instances, right? How we have the search that we can type into, and then it will filter. That's a minor nuance of the component itself, but essentially how we have just a straight list here, but also in this same component, right? We have headers here. We have node icons, just a red dot basically, but we could have had that as an icon. We could have had it as whatever we needed to handle, because the component is built so flexible enough that way we can have that kind of option. So I have one more example that you can use intersection observer for. You don't have to use it in just renderable components. You could use it also in let's say a third-party library, or like a JavaScript library, not library, built-in methods. The one I'm thinking of is intersection observer. So I built this a while ago for work called it's an intersection observer just built for React, right? And so here's the intersection observer, right? there's some nuance with this, how we need to know what data we're using, but we also need to know like the intersect method, which is a argument that you need to pass to, the intersection observer itself, instance itself. But basically, the main point that I want to get across here is we can use context here to provide, observe and unobserved methods handled by the intersection observer. And we can just use our component as a context provider, essentially, right? And whenever we use this context or this intersection observer, all we're doing is providing whatever contents inside of this component to be observed by this intersection observer, right? And that will be handled by the children. So basically, this intersection observer can only be used with the child that we define, which here is observer item, right? Which takes in the context of the intersection observer, right? The element ref that we're defining right here to be used to be observed by the intersect observer, as well as a child, which we are only making sure that we have a singular child of. That was just an important point for this particular instance, but again, it's on a as needed basis kind of thing. All we're doing is rendering the div element and the child. The div element, again, is the thing that we're actually observing. Although we could have simply passed a ref to the child doing react.clone element as well, passing a ref to this child component, as long as, of course, you're using react.forward ref to be able to forward that ref to that, to that component. And if you are not sure what intersection observer is, basically it's a instance built into JavaScript that allows you to observe instances when two elements are intersecting with the observer, intersecting with each other. It's a fun one to play with. I'll show an example later. I don't have a diagram to illustrate on hand, but we can just go to intersection observer on MDN. I like their example very much. Basically, if we scroll down, here we go. It will allow you to see how much it's intersecting by, as you can see by the percentage here. And then you can set the threshold in which they change, right? So this one is a 0.01 threshold where every 1% it changes, whereas on this one right here, every 10% it changes. Basically, that's what my component is doing right here. But the main point that I want to get across is you can use inversion of control also to handle observing elements, or you could even use this for whatever kind of context you might need to provide to a certain number of children, right? It's basically just a provider that you're using context for. And in this case, it just happened to be built around intersection observer. Cool. So where have you might seen this already? Good question, Kevin, from earlier. My favorite, we use material design for work, and I think it's a great example of inversion of control. And it's very, very prevalent. It's, in my opinion, almost seamless. And so here you can see that we have list, right? List item icon, list item text, right? It's very granular. And then its implementation right here, you can see that it's a list component, right? So you know that you're playing with a list. And then here you have a list item, right? And so whatever you need to put in this list item, in this case, a list item icon, right? And so I think material is a great reference in terms of being able to start conceptualizing, what is inversion of control, or at least seeing it in practice, right? Because they use it literally almost everywhere. This is just one example. Accordion is another one that I'm a big fan of as well. Let's go to the demos, where here, again, you have accordion summary, and accordion details. This one's a bit smaller. So here we have the accordion component, right? Accordion summary, in this case, it's the details that show up at the top here, and then accordion details, whatever shows up when you open it, right? And I think this is very elegantly simple, right? As the user of this component, if I were to import this from material, it's just simply, oh, I need an accordion and I need to have these pieces, and you just, basically plug and play exactly what you need. And so this, yeah, material is a great reference in terms of, one, being able to, figure out how you should build your own components. But also, well, whenever I build a new component, I try to think, how could I build it in such a way that it is as usable as material? Because material, I think, is very elegantly straightforward and simple to be able to just pull in the things that you need and use them as you need it. Even with a menu, for example, with material, you can use menu item without using menu, right? It's that flexible. Because again, these are just independent components that just happen to tie very well together. This one is a bit, this one being its own component is rightfully so, because again, you can use them however you need. Whereas in my examples with the, we go back to the panel, for example, which is right here. This header and body and footer, they correspond very tightly with this panel. So this is, I would say, rightfully so, all bundled together in a single component. Material color theme in my VS Code. I don't know. I am using, yes, community theme, material theme, high contrast. Oh, good eye. I totally forgot about that. And then, of course, Kent Dodds, his blog is a great reference in terms of like, just reading more about inversion control. I think he's just a really great reference in general for React. So why use it, right? I go on this whole entire shenanigans about, inversion control, like why would you use it, right? The pros is that it promotes a very good engineering experience, right? All the logic is consolidated. All the pieces do what they are specifically designed to do. Instead of having an entire drop-down component that does everything, you create the pieces of a drop-down component, and together they make a drop-down component. All right, so components become significantly more reusable and flexible, again, for the user, the person who is using these components itself. And not only that, lastly, it creates a lot better type checking if you're using TypeScript, which I highly recommend, because every single component is individually built and therefore kind of individually typed, right? It's a lot easier to consolidate your types. It's a lot easier to, pass, small morsels of data to each piece rather than, passing a whole massive list of props to a singular component. So what are the cons though, right? Because it's not a solve all for everything, right? It's definitely potentially more code. As you saw in my examples, right? To do the same thing was significantly longer lines of code. And, I had to do workarounds, right? There's a different way of thinking about reusability, and the other obstacles that you have to cover, like in the dropdown example, you'll have different issues that you need to solve. But with those new issues though, I believe that one, you get a better understanding of React, and two, you get the benefit of more flexible and reusable components. I think it's a win-win on both fronts. So when not to use inversion control, right? And yeah, I'll share these slides. I'll send them over to VJ after this. So when not to use inversion of control. It's simply put, you can't use inversion of control when you don't need it, right? It's not for everything. And I have a component here to show that. Here, I have these icon panels, right? Just an icon and a panel, right? There's not too much you can do about it, right? If I were to try to convert this into inversion of control, there's not too much I can do, right? I can't necessarily put this icon as a child of this because that doesn't make sense. If I make it as the first child, that doesn't make it a very good flexible component because it really ties the hands of the engineer to use it specifically as the first child of this component. So in that case, the way that component looks like is just like this, right? Icon panel takes children, which is going, whatever contents go in there, takes a class name for the panel and a container class name. And there's not really too much around to it, and as well as an icon if you need to change the icon. And there's no really way that I can think of, at least, to invert the controls to the user, right? It takes an icon and renders a panel. Not too much inverting that you can do. I forgot if I had another example. Oh, I do. So here actually uses that intersection observer that I was talking about earlier. See how when I'm scrolling through the list, these buttons highlight corresponding with the number that I'm on. I use intersection observer to be able to observe what item I'm currently sitting at. but this component is what I'm trying to target, where I have these buttons and the arrows and the little dots right here. There's no way for me to use inversion of control. And the reason why is because even if I use inversion of control, right, because it shortens the length as I'm scrolling up in numbers, as you see right here, right? There's no way, right? And also the numbers change as I'm scrolling. And so basically, as much as you would want this to be as a reusable component, it is built as a reusable component, but just not with inversion of control. And so it definitely has its time and place to use it, right? But it's not a solve all for everything. And again, this uses that intersection observer component, which happens to actually use inversion of control. So in some sense, I am using it, just not for the renderable pieces of the component. Any questions? I know that was more of a, well, in my opinion, I think it's a pretty heavy topic and definitely harder, in my opinion, to grasp, especially for fresher engineers and if you're not too familiar with React. So I'm happy to ask or answer more questions regarding it.
So I'll ask a question just because, you know, I really liked your example in that one slide. So is this a pattern that you just, you know, you kind of stumbled upon? Was it something that you know, read from maybe Can't See Dodds and then you were like, or MDN, and you just decided, hey, this is a great, you know, thing to try out. And then you started writing? Is that kind of how you started looking at intersection observers, for example?
So the first instance I saw was actually Bootstrap. Our what we used for work previously used React Bootstrap, and it had a modal component. And I really love that modal component. And it was because in the modal component, it had a modal body, or a modal component, a header, a body, and a footer, right? And sometimes we needed the footer, sometimes we didn't need the footer. And it was so elegant, right? All we needed to do is plug it in if we needed it. If not, we remove it. Simple as that. And then when we migrated over to Material, they didn't have the same exact kind of API as Bootstrap did. So we built our own around it. But because we liked the way it worked so much, we basically mirrored it. And then from there, we kind of just took off using inversion of control more and more. I wouldn't say it's a model from Bootstrap. It just happens that Bootstrap used inversion of control for that particular modal that we happen to like. Modal, sorry, I thought it said model in the chat. Yeah, we just started build more components like that, right? We would run into instances exactly what I was talking about, where we would build a component and we would pigeonhole ourselves into a very particular usage of that component, and it would shoot ourselves in the foot because then we would have to refactor the entire component just to do a simple thing, right? If only there was a better way, right? And so we did some research, read some articles, and you know, especially playing with the Material API, right? We figured that, oh, there is a better way to build these components in a more flexible manner for whomever is using the component.
So real quick, you know, where do you go and search for your, you know, articles or research? Like, let's say, and you mentioned Ken C. Dodds is one of them, but you know, you have another engineering problem. Where are you going to go to specifically start looking? What would you do besides
Sure.
Google it or DuckDuck?
Right. I follow some engineers on Twitter, like Dan Abramoff and Brian Vaughn. Those are the main ones I talk to. Brian Vaughn's responded to some of my Twitter comments, so you could say that we're on a first name basis too. And so, yeah, I just follow them on Twitter. They oftentimes post really good snippets of information. Dan Abramoff has a really good blog called Overreacted, which he talks about, you know, how, especially when hooks came out, a lot of the information that he posted on there were great resources and, you know, getting accustomed to hooks and how to make the best of them. Because especially at that, well, one, he probably wrote some of them being on the React team, and he just knows them to a T, right? And so who better to learn from the source himself? I think Brian Vaughn works on the React developer tools. And so, yeah, he's a great resource as well.
Did you watch his egghead stuff on Redux?
I did not.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
Yeah, but I wish I did. I know it's definitely a great resource for that. So I think he wrote React Redux actually.
Right, right. I just thought like I'd throw in that because I happened
Right.
to see it the other day too, and I was thinking, oh, okay, I guess I'll watch this series.
Yeah.
All right.
But that's primarily where I get my my information from, and just reading. I actually look into his source code for his blog itself, and just kind of mirror his practices as well.
Very cool. Does anybody else have any questions? We just want to, I know this is kind of a more difficult topic, but I actually gave Dylan permission to go really hardcore because, you know, I felt like it might be a good challenge. I always said that our group, you know, despite we're always kind of learning React and all these different frameworks, I think we can keep up with time. So like, you know, I don't want to slow anybody down, and I also don't want anybody to feel like they're you know, trapped and it's too hard. So, you know, feel free to ask as many questions as you like, and we'll try to make sure that some people leave with a good understanding. If not, we'll be here to talk about it later on in YouTube and stuff, Discord as well. And I see some comments actually in the chats. So Steven asks, when will this be posted on YouTube? As soon as we can. We're gonna post this probably tonight. I already have it recording, so this meetup is always, every meetup is always recorded. Sometimes there are glitches or things that happen, like people don't mute their microphones, so I have to do a little bit of light editing to kind of take out all of that and just kind of keep the content pretty clean and moving forward, straightforward. But other than that, like it shouldn't take a long time because everything pretty much is done on my MacBook, and then like I just posted to YouTube.
By the way, also here's the GitHub to all the code samples as well.
Perfect. Yes, please share your GitHub. And also, I guess maybe if you can kind of just point people to the parts that they should look at in particular. You know, obviously the inversion of control, different examples under the source folder or wherever it might be.
Yeah, so all of it's going to be in primarily the components folder. All of these components have the old dropdown being the way that I would previously do it, as well as now the current way. I think the only one that doesn't really have an example is intersection observer. Panel is the same way, as well as icon panel. Well, there's only one icon panel. I don't have an old way for that. But again, the only thing I don't have example for is intersection observer. This one is a little bit more of a complicated component. There's a lot that goes into that. Yeah, I don't have code examples for the complex example though. This one's pretty heavy. It's like 500 lines of code just to have these drop downs. And unfortunately, that's not in here for that. So I do apologize for that.
Okay, and I'm getting some more questions. So let's see here. I think one was from Sherry again for the UI example. Will you go back and show how you can drop in different child components in the material UI library? Oh yeah, and I remember what she was saying. She was saying that you know, when you were showing the material UI library, I think her screen kind of froze up, so she wasn't able to see what you were doing. So maybe if you can kind of go through and just talk about that one more time. How like that's a really good example of inversion of control.
Sure. So here, straight from material UI docs, right? You have, I like the accordion example. It's relatively small and I think straightforward. Here, right, you have an accordion component, right? So you know as the user that you're going to be playing with an accordion, right? An accordion takes in various items, right? Summary happens to be the items that go in the top here, and then details goes, you know, what's inside here, right? And so all you have to do is just pull the components that you need and then plop them right in. So here, right, we just need accordion details. We could just plop it right in where we need it. An even more flexible component would be lists. This one I think is a really good example of how flexible things can get, right? You have a list component, a list item icon, list item text, right? And then here, when you're using it, right, it's a bit overwhelming with how many list stuff we have, right? But here we're just rendering, we know we're playing with a list, right? And we have a list item and another list item and so forth, right? We just literally put exactly what we need, where we need it, and when we need it, right? Rather than having to map through an array of items, of objects, let's say, and then rendering exactly a certain element per that property in the object, right? Here, we're just literally putting what we need. And so even if we have something that we map through, we can just map through and render just what we need, rather than having to do a bunch of conditions in the list component itself to determine, oh, should we show an icon? Should we not show an icon? Should we show text, no text, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really flexible. And even so, you can just use, I'm not sure about list item, but I know for a fact that if you go into menu and you use menu item alone, which you have access to right here, you can just use menu item on its own, not even within a menu, right? And that goes to show how flexible these components are, because they are built so independently of each other, but they just happen to work so well with each other when paired together. And so I've used menu item not within a menu, and it works perfectly fine. Oh, one more good thing about these inversion of control is that you get to handle accessibility aspects individually. For example, here, I don't have to now put in role menu item anymore per item, right? Menu item already handles that for me, right? The material just has to do it once in that component, right? As well as the menu here, right? ARIA labels are already handled for you if you build the component to handle it like that. So it's also a huge advantage of using inversion of control.
I have a question.
Yeah, of course.
Looking at the material-ui.com site, I see that there's a pagination element in there. And in your example, you showed your pagination as not being appropriate for inversion of control. Does their pagination use inversion of control and you just needed a specific one that wasn't worth making more generic or flexible in the way that we've been looking at tonight?
Yeah, the reason why is because our designers were really particular on how it looked.
Mm-hmm.
And so actually the first thing I said is like, hey, material has this already. Can we just use it? And they're like, no, it has to, we want it to do this very thing where you scroll and it will select and the way it looks, right?
Yeah.
So I fought really hard for that, but yeah, you're absolutely right. They, the reason why I couldn't use inversion control was more so because of the, just the natural behavior. But even looking at their component directly right here, it doesn't look like they have too much inversion of control either. It's just a pagination component that takes account. And again, there's not too much you can do about that either. In my eyes, at least, it's fairly limited in terms of that kind of behavior for inversion of control, at least.
Well, one other library I've worked with is React-Bootstrap, and it came to mind because they use the dot notation in importing and exporting the things like you showed in some of your examples. So they have pagination.first, .prev, .item, .ellipsis, etc. in theirs.
Something like this right here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, I also looked briefly at Atlas. What's it called? Atlas Kit, the one from Bitbucket people.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, when you're looking at one of these UI libraries, does it help to know, oh, they used inversion of control?
No, it absolutely doesn't really matter for the user. It really matters if you are building it and you want to have whomever is using the component to really have an ease of engineering, right? It's like the best way that I've heard a metaphor is kind of like air, right? You kind of take it for granted and it's always there. But the moment that there's lack of air, does it really become a problem, right? So in this case, when it becomes a lack of good engineering experience, do you really start to complain about how much of an issue this library is?
Cool, thank you.
And I guess I'll just kind of add to that. I think that there's a lot of similarity in, what Dylan's been talking about tonight with, using these component libraries like Material UI, what he's been doing, inversion of control, and even with our group, using Team Hack and building reusable components. I was kind of talking about some of this to the Team Hack people. And I think that a lot of times, at work especially, you might have a job that tells you, okay, you have to build out this landing page tonight, or you have to build out, some modal, or build out some accordion, right? And so you build it out, and then you build it out maybe in your favorite language like React or Vue.js or Angular, or even just vanilla JavaScript. And then after you've built it out, it's built in one way, but then, maybe another month down the line, the boss is like, hey, I want to change all these inputs, and, I want to change the way this modal behaves. And, I want to have 3 other modals for these 3 other different landing pages that need to be able to do these different things. So at that point, you can reuse your component, but then you'll have to make all the different adjustments anyway into your component, especially if it's coded in a way that is like AKA hard coded. Props are always going to be the same props, or the event handler is always going to be the same. What do you do in specific cases where you don't need certain props, or maybe you don't need certain event handlers? Do you rewrite the component, and then you have many different versions of this component that you have to keep around? Or can you look at some of these more interesting design patterns where you kind of make your components a little bit more flexible, like inversion of control? So inversion of control, as far as like a design pattern, right? Like, I would say that that's kind of like the next level of sort of thinking about like your project and your building, right? Like the first step is just kind of like building out, stuff in React or whatever language you're trying to build it out in, so you get familiar with the language. But then as you start getting better at using the language, then it becomes more about like making sure that your work itself, the work that you're doing, is more there's more thought behind the scenes of how you're building your stuff. So it's a little bit more flexible for either yourself or the next person who's going to use the code, or maybe you work for Facebook, or some maybe you work for Airbnb or Material UI, right? And you want to make these components that you built in this open source library more developer friendly, more engineering friendly for the people who go on to use it. That's what it's about. It's about like this sort of abstraction, higher level thinking about how your code works with other code. So it's not always just, sandboxing people, if that makes sense. Does that make sense to everybody out there?
Sounds about right to me.
Yeah, and I think that's something that for this group too, I definitely want to start exploring. There's been a lot of requests by some of the people in this group who are kind of doing more the senior level work, at different companies, to explore some of the design patterns. If you remember Dave McGrath, he's in this group as well. He spoke to me a month ago about how he used to look at a lot of different design patterns at a meetup that he was doing in Woodland Hills. And, I was like, that's a really great idea. We should start looking and exploring at some of these design patterns, because I think it's really helpful for people who are shifting from just doing coding to becoming like full, software engineering. And that's also kind of what the whole HackBuddy thing is about too. Want to help people kind of transition from just, being a code monkey to being more like, an actual engineer, thinking about like the different things you're building and designing, so it's not just inflexible in some ways. So yeah, I'm just gonna keep it open for some more questions. I see some more stuff in the chat, so feel free to ask in the chat if you'd like. And if you don't have questions about this particular meetup, you can also just ask questions in general, or maybe just kind of comment about like things you're doing, because that was one of the discussions that we were talking about at the beginning of this meetup. Just want to, yeah, actually, Kevin just asked, can we spam our LinkedIn profiles? Definitely, like, go ahead and throw in your LinkedIn. just so that other people can network and meet you. It's a good way to just, like I always say, I think that your network is probably the most important thing that you have, because from your network, everything else kind of like grows, right? The people you surround yourself with help you become a better programmer, because you know, if you hang out with smart people, right, like you end up becoming a smart person. So definitely network, definitely trade LinkedIn, say hello to anybody that messaged tonight, and maybe just say, you know, how you met, how you found out about the group or whatever. But yeah, just kind of coming back to this main point, right? Want to help people think, you know, along the lines of better engineering, better development. So I'll keep it open for a few minutes, chat, or just kind of like, you know, jump in whenever you feel like it, and let us know, you know, what things are you working on? What do you want to get better at? So that for next year, we can definitely help you in any way that we can as a group.
Hey, I'm going to hop off, but I just wanted to say thank you, Dylan. Thanks, VJ, for hosting.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah.
Is it Widjaja? Is that how we pronounce it?
Yeah, that was great. That was really close. Yeah.
Such an interesting name. Where does it hail from?
Indonesia.
Cool.
Yeah. And Sherry, yes, debugging could be easier in inversion and control, primarily because now you have independent consolidated logic per item. So you can easily identify if it's an issue with the parent component or the individual item that might have an issue, or not necessarily item, just whatever independent component that is separate from the parent that might have an issue. So I would say debugging is definitely easier.
Actually, Dylan, that's a great point. Did you unit test any of your, you know, your repo?
No, I did not add unit test cases to my Git repository. But actually, on that note, it is absolutely fantastically easier to unit test case inverted controlled components. Reason being because well, you can test individual pieces. Again, because everything is so consolidated, right? It's a lot easier to test small morsels of components rather than, you know, massive, like a massive drop-down component, for example. You can just test the individual parts.
So you would do like specific unit tests and just.
I would write a test case for probably one as a whole, and then smaller test cases for the individual components. But actually, let me see if I have a test case for, let's see. This is my test case for the group smart search dropdown. So the one that the advanced example for the dropdown. So I basically made a sample component, right, with my inverted controlled component, and then I would test per that component. Obviously, depending on the extent of your items, you might have to do individual test cases per component. This one, I was able to get away with just creating an example component, using it, and then testing accordingly per what I expected to happen for that component.
This is pretty awesome. I love it. When you do your testing, like, do you? Well, I know that you run the test runner, but I was just curious. Do you also, you know, use any tools like Travis or Cypress? You know.
Not currently, no. My test cases usually lie with just unit test cases. I haven't gotten really into Cypress or Travis or Selenium too much either.
Yeah,
just anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Playwright, exactly. Okay. And I think Sherry, we kind of just talked about testing. Okay. And let's see, she asked about the dropdown. Sherry, what specifically about the dropdown were you interested in?
like how I would test this component. So I'd probably do something very similar. Here, I'm assuming I'm using React testing library. Oops, testing library React. And this is TypeScript, right? And so here I do scribe, and then const component is equal to, I need to import the import drop down from, let's see, oh, I don't have it. Oh, okay, well, drop down. And then here I just make a sample component that uses the drop down. So here, drop down, and then drop down item, oops, drop down dot item. And then based off of what I have done in here, right here, I have on select, gosh, there we go. It'll be some method. I'll probably have to do const on select just mock just that function. And so here on select, and then in here, when I'm actually writing the test case, drop down. So here, when I test it, here, hello. I don't know if I have a test runner on this repo. I forgot if I set it up or not. But basically,
That's okay. I feel like you can just kind of like, you know, give us some pseudo code if you want.
Yeah, component. And then here, rend or get by text, expect. And then to be in the document. And then also we would want to test to see if on select has been clicked. So, oops, on select should be called. So here, oops, keep hitting colon, render component. I might pass it as a prop, but because that way I could just pull that directly. But anyway, need to do fire event, click, get by text, hello. Let's import that real quick. Oh, my event is not working. There we go. Fire event. And then expect on select to have been called, something like that. This essentially is how I would test something like this. And then secondarily, I could also test it on click here as well per that component. As long as I, create a just mocked function for that, I could just check if it's been called or not. At least is how I would do it in React testing library.
So basically, when you're testing, you just basically want to just, essentially check that whatever children get passed, they're rendering, as well as any methods that get passed as props or any props that get passed. You just want to do like that all of those things are showing up. And
primarily, and this is my general philosophy with tests, is that you should test exactly what the user might see or interact with. So in this case, right, we want to see that hello actually does show up. So we check to see, does hello show? And so yes, the user would in fact see hello, as well as, let's say they click hello, right? Then we fire event just to make sure that in fact, the method that we had correspond with hello, or I guess on select in this case with the dropdown, does in fact get called. So anything that the user might experience or see is what I like to test.
That's great. That's an excellent philosophy. All right.
I don't need to test like implementation where, like for example, the effectiveness of a use effect or use state. I know for a fact those are already tested and done because React has their own set of testing suites as well. So there's no need to implement tests for those.
Right. It's about the user experience, not about the actual React framework.
Library. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Love that. All right, I think we're close to getting to time. I just want to give like a few more minutes to anybody still straggling, wondering if they want to say anything. This is kind of like the last time you can ask. And then after that, basically, if you have follow-up questions, you can go on YouTube, leave a comment there. And if we see any comments, we'll pass them on to Dylan. And that said too, you can always feel free to, join us on Discord. Dylan, I'm going to take over the screen. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And let's go ahead and do this real quick. Okay, so I'll move a lot of this stuff out of the way. And yeah, basically going back to, the whole spiel about our group, right? So if you are new, basically the easiest way to follow us is, go to our website, javascriptla.net, which will eventually also become hackbuddy.com or hackbuddy.org or hackbuddy.net, whatever you like. We have already made those name changes everywhere on social media. So some people like Twitter, so that's why I brought that up, twitter.com/hackbuddyorg. Basically, you can also follow us on YouTube at the same address, youtube.com/hackbuddy.org or hackbuddyorg. It's all just one word. And yes, we post every video on our meetups to our YouTube channel. So it's a good place to go and check out all the videos that we've done, as well as, there's videos that explain how to do stuff in more detail, especially JavaScript, some of the methods. React is pretty good if you want to learn about like an intro to React. I did a video series on it. There's also an ES6 video series if you're kind of new or want to learn ES6. And then, there's also a full course on Udemy that you can go and check out that we did. And that has 6 hours of video content, which is pretty useful. Like I said, we do have Team Hack, which is really helpful for people who want to, not only just study this stuff, but actually put it in practice. And the cool thing about Team Hack is that you get to build stuff that you probably might actually do anyway at work. So it's a good way to be ahead of the game with work. Also practice a lot of stuff that, you may not get exposure to at work. Like I said, I've been doing mainly like PHP for a while and really didn't get a chance to use a lot of this other stuff outside of that until I started just doing more open source and, just practicing outside and then bringing that inside to my work and then, changing the system from within, which is pretty cool. So, I feel more confident about like my own coding skills in some ways. And then having these meetups with, cool people like Dylan, just like kind of like accentuates the whole thing. So, if you want that full experience for yourself to, join our Team Hack, we are doing a Twitch channel eventually. I say eventually because, right now, like I'm kind of balancing all these different projects. But one of the things that we're doing is, so if you need help with learning some of this stuff, sometimes we'll go on Twitch and live stream like a pair programming session. And so you can jump in on that and see some code. It's not polished like YouTube is, where YouTube is like the actual video content that's been edited and all that. So Twitch is more kind of just an environment for us to kind of fail around in. So, but people like that. And I think, like I said, one person I follow a lot is Benjamin Johnson. So, if you like the stuff that he does, it'll be kind of similar to that. Let me just really quickly check the questions. I think Dylan, you're doing a pretty good job of answering some of the questions there. But yeah, so join Team Hack, get the full experience, help us build our storybook, learn inversion of control, help us build better components so we can have like this cool component library that we can use to build some of these, business items and then make our own lives easier, as well as join the YouTube channel if you're new, join the Twitter channel. And if you like this video, if you're watching it on YouTube or whatever after the fact, feel free to leave a thumbs up or comments in the comment section, as I mentioned before. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. That's the spiel. I think that was pretty much also the time frame for questions, unless anybody has like a last minute question. All right. Well then, thank you so much. And I will see you all at the next meetup. And I look forward to also hearing from you on Discord and Slack. Thank you, Dylan, for a great meetup. This was excellent. And I will see you when I see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.